What's going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle back with the Fantasy Headliners. Week 1 is in the books, and it's now time to look forward to Week 2, which includes every Monday taking a look at the waiver wire and seeing if there's anybody that we need to take a stab at. Now, hopefully everybody's Week 1 was fabulous. Speaking from just a pure football standpoint, there was times this year when a lot of people didn't think we were going to get any football in 2020, and we got a full slate of games in Week 1. So that in itself is a victory for all. Now, if your fantasy team didn't quite fare as well, that's okay, ladies and gentlemen. It's only Week 1. There is a ton of time left to turn this thing around and make this a winner. So don't freak out. Don't panic. It's only Week 1. Don't worry about it. You had a process. You followed a process. Don't give up on that process just yet. But we got to jump into it. We got to talk about guys that we are going to take a look at this week. And everybody that I bring up in this episode isn't necessarily a guy that I'm running out to add right away. It's purely informal, keeping you updated on the guys that might be trending up that we need to be keeping an eye on, whether it is putting in a waiver wire request for them this week, or maybe it's next week or the week after. But they're guys that might be trending up, so we got to keep an eye on them and roll with the punches. If we see that they're gaining more momentum, then at that point, it's time to pick them up. But I heard a lot from people last year. They said that the reason that they were able to win some of their leagues was this show, because they kept them informed about guys that were up and coming, and they could move on them a little bit quicker than what their teammates did. So that's my job, is to keep you informed on the guys that could be seeing a rise in their value here pretty soon. And we're going to talk about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we need to be thinking about possibly adding. And then I've got some quarterback streamers and some defensive streamers that we should be taking a look at for Week 2. All right, Headliner Nation, let's jump into our running backs first. And the first guy to talk about real quick is Frank Gore of the New York Jets. 24 yards on 6 carries, only owned in 0.5% of leagues. But we don't know what's going on with Le'Veon Bell, dealing with a little bit of a hamstring issue. Now, this episode is always recorded on Sunday nights, so we haven't really heard anything on Monday as of yet. So it's one thing to do is to kind of keep an eye on that and see what happens. Now, again, I'm not running to add Frank Gore by any means, but Frank Gore is a guy that, regardless of his age, he's always seemed to get touches, and even in limited touches, doesn't do too bad. Will he end up seeing more touches? It's something for us to eye. Next guy to talk about, Myles Gaskin from the Miami Dolphins. Now, Myles Gaskin was a guy that I liked coming out of college. I thought he could be a productive running back in the NFL. I don't think he's going to blow the doors off any field anytime soon. I don't think he's going to be a top running back, but I think he could be productive. And we saw a little bit of that two-way production this week. Jordan Howard was basically an afterthought for the Miami Dolphins. Now, maybe it was because they were playing from behind, but Myles Gaskin still saw 9 attempts on the ground for 40 yards, 4.4 average, and then he had 4 targets, caught all 4 of those for 26 yards. He's only owned in 0.1% of leagues. So if you're dealing with any type of injuries, if you're in a deeper league or anything like that, Myles Gaskin is definitely a guy to keep an eye on. If he continues to see a lot of touches both on the ground and the air, then we might need to start looking forward to adding him a little bit sooner rather than later, starting next week. Now, it is time for my Manscaped must-add player of the week. That's right, the Fantasy Headliners, we are sponsored by Manscaped. If you head over to manscaped.com and use the promo code Headliners, all capital letters, you can get 20% off any of their awesome items. Again, manscaped.com, promo code Headliners, and 20% off anything there. So my Manscaped must-have player of the week this week is running back Nyheim Hines from the Indianapolis Colts. Now, everyone here at the Fantasy Headliners was high on Nyheim Hines going into the draft. And then the Colts threw us a little bit of a curveball and drafted Jonathan Taylor. Was not really expecting them to use that draft pick. And at that point, we backed off a little bit and said, I don't think there's really going to be a whole lot of room for 3 running backs. Hines kind of seems like the guy to miss out on touches. However, even before Marlon Mack's injury this weekend, sounding like he's got an Achilles injury, may even be done for the year. Even before that, Nyheim Hines was on the field an awful lot. Looking at his numbers from this past week, he had 7 attempts on the ground for 28 yards. He had 8 receptions for 48 yards on 8 targets, and he scored 2 touchdowns. 1.3% owned in fantasy leagues right now. Again, Marlon Mack being out of the picture, there is more than enough room for 2 running backs in this offense. So Nyheim Hines in half PPR and PPR formats is a must add for me this week, especially if you were a Mac owner, especially if you're currently a Taylor owner. Make sure that you go out and get him right now. Now, moving on to the next guy, running back James Robinson. He was a guy that I talked about this preseason over on Patreon. I wrote an article that included James Robinson from Jacksonville and said, keep an eye on this guy. If anything happens to Leonard Fournette, he could quickly step in. And we saw that this week. Now, nothing that blew the door off the numbers, the stat box, nothing like that. However, he did have 16 carries, which led the backfield, 62 yards, wasn't that efficient, only 3.4 yards per carry, but that's all right. And he had one reception on one target for 28 yards. It seems like Robinson is going to be the lead back there in Jacksonville. Now, the good thing about this week is Jacksonville played a lot better than what we had assumed. So that could have led to that a little bit. When they get into some games where they're going to be more behind, he might not see nearly as many touches, but he did well enough this week that we got to continue to keep an eye on him and potentially add him if you haven't done so already. Well below 50% owned, so you can still get him pretty cheap right now. Also, just to let you know, just because I'm going back and forth, I'm not ignoring you or anything, and I'm not trying to be rude. I got a new setup here in the studio. I've got multiple screens around me, which is glorious, and I'm starting to keep all my notes on this screen instead of trying to have them here and look up and down. I'm just keeping everything right here. So I'm going to be going back and forth a little bit, so I apologize if that offends you. I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to stay more organized, and this is a way to do it. Running back, Adrian Peterson. Who would have thought that Adrian Peterson would lead the Lions in rushing in week 1? That's something none of us would have thought about just a couple of weeks ago. And then Washington releases him. He ends up in Detroit, and the dude goes off for 93 yards for a 6.6 average. And he also saw 3 receptions on 3 targets for 21 yards, and he dipped all the way down to 39% owned. This was over Kerryon Johnson. Kerryon Johnson got a little bit of work at the beginning of the game, but Adrian Peterson, they rolled with him. He looked good. Does he look like 25-year-old Adrian Peterson? No, he does not, but he still looks pretty young and agile for his age. He still had a little bit of burst. He made some guys miss. He was still able to make some one cuts at the line and get upfield, make some things that were nothing into something. So he still looked good for being at his age. So he's the guy you really should be keeping an eye on this week as well. And if you're thin at the running back position, if you're someone that did wide receiver heavy early, Adrian Peterson is another guy that I'm going to run out and get. After Washington released him, he dropped all the way down to 39% owned. So more than likely, he is going to be available in your fantasy leagues. The last running back that I want to talk about this week is Joshua Kelly. Okay, Joshua Kelly was a little bit of a thorn in the side of Austin Eckler owners this week. Austin Eckler, I'm not worried about him. He still saw more than enough touches on the ground, and they're going to get him included in the air here pretty soon. So Eckler should still end up being a good option this year. He ended up having 60 yards on 12 carries and did score a pretty pivotal touchdown for them. He's only 1.2% owned right now. This is a guy that you're definitely going to add maybe as a bench stash, or if you're an Austin Eckler owner, you grab him as a handcuff. I did bring up Joshua Kelly a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago really, when I was doing some training camp updates, because he was looking like the guy to become the number 2 back there. So if you would have listened at that time, he probably is already on your radar. But if you weren't subscribed at that point, or you didn't really think he'd be doing much of anything, it's time to open our eyes and keep an eye on him a little bit more, because if he continues to get some of these goal line touches, that's when we might become a little bit more concerned about Austin Eckler. But for now, keeping an eye on him and seeing what he does over the coming weeks. All right, I have a lot of wide receivers to talk about this week, which is probably good because we've seen a lot of injuries at the wide receiver position lately. But we're going to kick it off from the guy on Thursday Night Football, Sammy Watkins. For the second straight year in a row, he balls out and has a big week 1. Keep in mind that last year, after Sammy Watkins week 1, he didn't even come close to touching that performance the rest of the season. So, what happens going forward? I will say this, I'm not a Sammy Watkins truther by any means. And last week I definitely had him as a sit because I wasn't expecting much from him. But it's not necessarily his performance that makes me go, whoa, holy crap, we got to be paying attention. It's the fact that Mecole Hardman wasn't really looked at that much, which is interesting that he wasn't on the field a whole lot. Demarcus Robinson saw quite a bit of targets, but he dropped 2 touchdowns. So is Sammy Watkins a guy that can really establish himself as the wide receiver 2, have a full 16-game healthy season, and produce all season long? I mean, he gave us a stat line of 7 receptions, 82 yards, and a touchdown last week. He's only 44% owned right now. When you play in Kansas City and you have 2 wide receivers, there's more than enough targets to go around. Yeah, you've got Kelsey. Yeah, you've got Hill. Yeah, you've got CEH. But Sammy Watkins, if he can give us anywhere from 5 to 7 receptions a week for anywhere between 50 and 80 yards and has a touchdown here and there, I mean, he's a guy that you have on your bench that you think about maybe flexing or putting in a wide receiver 3 position, especially if it's going up against a defense that could give up quite a bit of yards. So keep an eye on that as well. Yes, he burned a lot of people last year. I'm not running out to add him by any means. But if they don't start involving Mecole Hardman more and more anytime soon, Sammy Watkins is going to be a guy that definitely should be on our bench moving forward. Wide receiver Keelan Cole, a guy that was brought up a lot last year for Jacksonville. He goes 5 for 47 with a touchdown this week, and he's owned in 0% of leagues, apparently. So nobody owns Keelan Cole, which makes sense, because there was really no reason to add him. However, this is a guy that was a big play threat a couple of years ago. We thought he might be the same thing last year. Didn't do anything last year. Maybe this was the year. Maybe we were just a year early. Again, another guy to keep an eye on. Gardner Minshew, who I'll talk about in a few minutes when I talk about QB streamers. If he continues to kind of keep up what we saw, then Keelan Cole is definitely a good person to add. Now, I will say this about Gardner Minshew, only ended up having 173 yards. So he wasn't a guy that was driving the ball down the field too much. But the big play was kind of from Keelan Cole this week. We didn't see it from DJ Chark. We saw it from Cole instead. So maybe he ends up kind of separating himself as that big play guy, kind of that boom or bust player each and every week of the season. Wide receiver Steven Sims. If you bought the draft guide, you already know Steven Sims and you know how good he could be this year. And week 1 was not really that big of a disappointment. He had 50 receiving yards on 3 receptions, but he averaged 16.7 yards per reception. So a good start to the year for him. Dwayne Haskins looked pretty good. Washington wins a game that not a lot of people expected them to win, and Steven Sims is only 2.5% owned right now. In PPR and half PPR leagues, I expect him to get more and more and more involved as the season wears on. I'm definitely going to be adding him as soon as possible. For our next wide receiver, Quintez Cephus from the Detroit Lions. Now, the 3 for 43 stat line probably isn't anything to write home about, right? You're not getting overly excited about that. 10 targets. Most targets for the Lions this past week. What happens with Kenny Golladay? Now, if Kenny Golladay comes back, Cephus, I'm not expecting that much more because Danny Amendola was also included in the game plan quite a bit, and Stafford looked his way quite often as well in week 1. In a lot of critical situations, Stafford seemed to be going towards Amendola. So when Golladay gets back, Cephus probably doesn't see nearly as many targets, but it all depends on Golladay. If Golladay is going to miss another week, Cephus with 10 targets, we definitely have to be monitoring that situation because the more targets he gets, the more opportunity he has. Another favorite of mine that is under 50% owned, Anthony Miller, wide receiver from the Chicago Bears. A huge catch late in that game to put the Chicago Bears up on the Detroit Lions. 4 receptions, 76 yards. He did have 6 targets, only 45% owned right now. Trubisky looked like garbage to start the game, okay? Don't get anything misconstrued here. Trubisky still is not a big-time quarterback, but he seems to be able to get the ball to Anthony Miller and Allen Robinson just fine throughout the course of a game. There's going to be some up and down performances, but Anthony Miller is definitely a guy that's going to be wide receiver 3 consideration all year long, and honestly probably needs to be around 70% rostered right now. If you follow us here on the Fantasy Headliners, you might already own him. In fact, in our MVP chat for our Patreon members, a lot of people were saying earlier when Anthony Miller's name was brought up, we already own him because Kyle's been talking about him so darn much. Marquez Valdez Scantling from the Green Bay Packers, only 0.5% owned. he could end up being that big play wide receiver for Aaron Rodgers. He averaged 24 yards per catch today. He went 4 for 96 in a touchdown. Allen Lazard is probably a little bit safer as a wide receiver too, but Allen Lazard probably isn't going to have that big play ability that MVS has. So yeah, MVS could be a little bit boom or bust, but he's definitely a guy that's going to put together some huge weeks throughout the season. It looks like he might finally be starting to come into his own a little bit. Maybe that connection with Aaron Rodgers is developing, and he's going to take a step forward as well. Robbie Anderson, okay, what's he do? He's the big play guy. 6 receptions, 115 yards, and a touchdown. Teddy Bridgewater going down the field a little bit is good. That's what I wanted to see out of him. Wasn't hating on Teddy Bridgewater at any point. Wasn't hating on DJ Moore at any point. This is good news, ladies and gentlemen. If you own DJ Moore, this is great news for DJ Moore and good news for Robbie Anderson as well, because it means, again, that big playability is going to be there. Only 11% owned right now. Definitely going to be taking a look at him. The Carolina defense, it's got some names on it, but it's not going to be great, okay? It's probably going to be a bottom 10 defense at some point this season. It's not going to be that great all year long, so they're probably going to have to throw the ball quite often. Robbie Anderson, definitely a guy that you can run and stash from wide receivers right now. Now, I've only got 3 tight ends to talk about on the show this week, and we're going to kick it off with Dallas Goedert. He was a sit for me last week because I even said in that show, I was like, I'm not going to get hurt by Goedert again, okay? Because I've fallen into this trap in the past. I'm definitely a guy who has said, man, if the Eagles can just move to more 12 personnel and get Goedert on the field more often, he's a guy that really could produce. And now we're hearing there might be some rumblings about Zach Ertz not being happy with his contract negotiations, whatever it may be. Goedert could end up being the guy of the future, but this past week, he was the guy of the present as well. He had 9 targets. He caught 8 of those for 101 yards and a touchdown, and he's under 50% owned. So if you're somebody that waited till the last minute to draft tight end and you don't feel your situation is that great, Dallas Goedert could be a guy coming up. Now, Deshaun Jackson, we were high on him earlier in the week, but on Sunday we pumped the brakes and told everybody to start pivoting because they lost one of their offensive linemen, and of course Miles Sanders being out as well. Now, when Miles Sanders comes back and he's healthy, if Boston Scott ends up being back next week, I'm still not hearing a whole lot on his injury yet, then maybe some of those targets start to disappear from Dallas Goedert a little bit. But again, in those shallow leagues where maybe you just didn't really draft well at the tight end position, if Dallas Goedert is still out there, I would run and add him because I think they're going to be running some more 12 personnel and they're going to be getting him on the field even more often in 2020 after we've seen this big performance from him in week 1. Jordan Reed. Now, I'm not adding Jordan Reed right now, but I just want to bring it up because Travis Kelce, wrong person. George Kittle left the field early in their game on Sunday. Now, he did say after the game in the second half, he was fine. It's not going to end up being an issue. But keep an eye on it, okay? Those knee injuries can be tricky. You know, he could end up waking up tomorrow and the knee's swollen up. You know, he could end up having an issue later on in the week. You know, maybe he ends up being limited at some point in time. I think he's all right for right now. But if anything happens to George Kittle, Jordan Reed, if healthy, is definitely gonna be a guy that can bring home some big time numbers at the tight end position. And last but not least, for my tight ends this week, it's O.J. Howard. Now, that name sounds familiar because last year I was really high on O.J. Howard. I thought he was going to be a guy that could definitely have a great season. That didn't end up happening. But he ended up outplaying Rob Gronkowski this week. Now, Rob Gronkowski, as he gets back into the flow of things, I mean, he didn't play at all last year, so give the guy a break. No preseason games. Didn't play at all last year. He's going to have to shake that rust off a little bit, right? Well, O.J. Howard stepped in for him this past week and caught 4 receptions on 6 targets for 36 yards and a touchdown. Gronk only had 3 targets this week. So maybe O.J. Howard starts getting on the field a little bit more. You know, Tom Brady didn't look at his best this past week against the Saints, but, you know, who can blame him, okay? New offense for the first time in his 20-year career. A lot of new receivers that he's trying to work with. No preseason to kind of start to hone some of those things in. And now you get out there in week 1 and you have to go to New Orleans. You know, that's a tough matchup for anybody, even the GOAT himself. But as he starts to get more familiar with the offensive system, until he gets to that comfort level, maybe he kind of goes back to, what's comfortable for him, and that's targeting those tight ends. So OJ Howard can definitely be a guy over the next couple of weeks that we see his role increase if Tom Brady starts to form that connection with him, and it seems like it may already be happening. All right, so nobody out there should have to be streaming quarterbacks yet, but I still want to bring up a couple of guys for next week that could be streamed if need be. Gardner Minshew from the Jacksonville Jaguars, he completed 19 of 20 passes this past week. The animal spirit himself, Gardner Minshew, I mean, he just continues to impress, right? 173 yards and 3 touchdowns to go with it. I'd like to see those yards tick up just a little bit. A lot of people talked about him this offseason. I did bring him up in an under the radar breakout video, but that was the one thing that I brought up, is that even though he was completing a lot of passes, he wasn't gaining a whole lot of yards last year in a majority of his games. So can he start to bring those yards up? If he can, Gardner Minshew might be a guy that we're looking at as a quarterback 1 at some point this season. As of right now, I'm not really ready to take that leap. Great first week of the season for him, but I want to see those yards start to tick up a little bit more and a little bit more. Jared Goff as well. I'm going to keep an eye on Jared Goff. Next week, he goes up against the Eagles, who looked like garbage last week. All right. Now, the Eagles are going to have better weeks, and they're going to look better next week. But Jared Goff on Sunday Night Football, which again, I'm recording during, because we got to get this information out to you as quickly as we can on Mondays. He's looking pretty good so far. That connection between him and Bobby Trees, that's kind of rolling a little bit. He's only 36% owned right now, and he's really he's doing a good job of spreading the ball around, okay? He's not pushing the ball to a single guy other than Robert Woods really being that main guy, but they seem to be doing a good job of that, trying to spread the defense, doing a lot of different things there in LA. Sean McVay, this is a guy, he's a great offensive coach. Yeah, kind of maybe took a little bit of a step back last year, but this is a guy that's going to adjust himself and the game plan to make his quarterback as successful as possible. So next week, going up against Philadelphia, if you find yourself in a position where you do need to stream, Jared Goff could be a decent option for you. All right, I've got 2 defenses to stream next week if you're looking for one, and the first one is going to be the Chicago Bears going up against the New York Giants. Now, the Giants have not played as of this recording, so I don't know how they look in week 1, but we do know it's the New York Giants, okay? And the Chicago Bears, not bad against Matthew Stafford and the Lions in week 1. They didn't really pressure him too much, didn't get in the backfield a whole lot, but they still looked pretty good for week 1, and they're under 50% owned right now. Going up against the New York Giants next week, and Daniel Jones, a guy that can get, a little bit shaky in the pocket at times, could end up being a week where this defense comes into their own a little bit more often. The secondary looked pretty good in coverage, though. I'd like to see them create some more turnovers, get to the quarterback a little bit more, and that is going to happen. My other team to stream is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, they held up, the defense did. It held up pretty well for a majority of the time against Drew Brees. To start the game, Drew Brees didn't look that great. They seem to be playing very well, but again, it's Drew Brees. It's in New Orleans. You're not going to be able to stop him for that long anyway. So even the best defenses can break in that situation. But Tampa's only 34% owned right now, and they get Carolina next week. So Carolina is a team that defense, again, could kind of take another step forward. Could be a good streaming option for you next week. Could see some QB pressure because that offensive line maybe a little bit suspect, so we could see some of that offensive pressure created next week, leading to some bad throws from Teddy Bridgewater. There you have it, Headliner Nation. Our waiver wire show for week 2 is in the books. Again, you don't have to run out and add all of these guys, but at least be keeping them on your radar for right now. Is there somebody that I didn't bring up in the video? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to them and let you know my thoughts on adding them this week. Also, hit that like button, okay? If you are new here to the Fantasy Headliners and you haven't become a part of Headliner Nation yet, hit that subscribe button for me as well. Headliner Nation, hopefully you all are staying safe and staying healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.